I woke up that Tuesday morning to find a 6-foot privacy fence running straight through my tomato plants, and I knew my peaceful life in Riverside, California was about to get complicated. My name is Victor Radford, and I had spent the last 3 years turning my backyard into a slice of paradise. The soil in this part of Southern California wasn't great when I started, so I had hauled in compost by the truckload, amended the earth with peat moss and manure, and carefully cultivated raised beds that produced the most beautiful vegetables you had ever seen. My tomatoes were legendary among my friends. My cucumbers were crisp and sweet. My pepper plants produced enough jalapenos to keep me in salsa all year long. But now there was a fence, right through the middle of it all. I stood there in my bathrobe, coffee mug in hand, staring at the wooden monstrosity that had apparently been erected sometime between midnight and dawn. The fence posts had crushed 3 of my tomato plants completely. The horizontal boards ran directly over my cucumber bed, and the thing extended about 15 feet into what was definitely, unquestionably, my property. I walked along the fence line, my bare feet getting wet from the morning dew on the grass. The construction was professional. I had to give them that. Treated wood, proper posts set in concrete, the whole 9 yards. But it was also completely, absolutely, 100% on my land. My property line was clearly marked. I had the survey from when I bought the house. The back corner of my lot extended in a small triangle that jutted out past the rear of my neighbor's yard. It was an odd configuration, probably the result of some weird subdivision planning from the 1970s, but it was mine, and someone had just built a fence through it. I went inside and pulled out my property documents. The survey was clear as day. That triangular section belonged to me, and it included my entire garden area. I had specifically chosen that spot because it got full southern exposure and was protected from the wind by the neighbor's oleander bushes. My phone rang at exactly 8:30. I should have known. "Mr. Radford, this is Patricia Cunningham from the Riverside Meadows Homeowners Association." The voice was sharp, clipped, and carried the tone of someone who was used to being obeyed without question. "Good morning," I said carefully. "I'm calling to inform you that the HOA has completed the installation of a privacy fence to properly delineate the common area green space from private properties. You'll notice the new fence along your rear property line." "That's not my property line," I said. "The fence is on my land." There was a pause. "Mr. Radford, the HOA board conducted a survey of the common areas, and the fence has been placed exactly where it needs to be. The area behind the fence is HOA common property." "No, it's not. I have the survey from my purchase 3 years ago." "That triangle is mine." "I'm afraid you're mistaken. The HOA has jurisdiction over all common areas, and we've determined that the green space in question belongs to the community." I felt my jaw tighten. "Patricia, I'm looking at my property survey right now. The fence is 15 feet onto my property. It's literally built through my garden." "The HOA doesn't recognize that survey. Our records show differently." "You don't recognize my survey. That's not how property ownership works." Her voice took on a more aggressive edge. "Mr. Radford, I suggest you review your HOA covenants. The association has the right to maintain and manage all common areas. If you interfere with HOA property, including the new fence, you'll be subject to fines of up to $500 per day. You built a fence through my tomato plants. Those plants were on HOA property and have been removed as part of the landscaping improvement project. Now, I'm calling as a courtesy to inform you of the new boundary. Good day, Mr. Radford." She hung up before I could respond. I stood there holding my phone, feeling my blood pressure rising. I had dealt with the HOA before. Every homeowner in Riverside Meadows had. The association was notorious for being overly strict about everything from lawn height to mailbox color, but this was different. This wasn't about some petty rule violation. This was theft of my actual property. I got dressed and went outside for a closer look. The fence was even worse in the full morning light. Not only had they destroyed my tomatoes, but I could see now that they had torn out my cucumber bed entirely. The soil was scraped away, leaving raw earth. My pepper plants were on the wrong side of the fence now, technically on what they claimed was HOA property. I pulled out my phone and took about 50 pictures from every angle. Then I went inside and scanned my property survey and deed. I was not going to let this stand. The Riverside Meadows HOA office was located in a small building near the neighborhood entrance. It was a single-story structure painted in the approved community colors, which were a boring beige and brown combination that made everything look like it was designed in 1985 and never updated. I walked in with my folder of documents. A young woman sat at the reception desk, looking bored. "I need to speak with Patricia Cunningham," I said. "You have an appointment?" "No, but she called me this morning about a fence that was illegally built on my property." The receptionist's eyes widened slightly. "Oh, you're the garden guy. Hold on." She picked up the phone and spoke quietly. A moment later, Patricia Cunningham emerged from a back office. Patricia was exactly what I expected. She was probably in her late 40s, with blonde hair styled in that particular way that required weekly salon visits to maintain. She wore a cream-colored pantsuit and had reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. Her expression was one of practiced superiority. "Mr. Radford, I wasn't expecting you to come in person. I wanted to show you my property survey. The fence is on my land." She didn't even look at the documents I was holding out. "As I explained on the phone, the HOA doesn't recognize that survey. Our records are clear." "Can I see your records?" "HOA documents are not available to individual homeowners for review. Board business is confidential." "That's not legal." "I have a right to see HOA records." Patricia's smile was cold. "You can submit a written request, which will be reviewed at the next board meeting in 6 weeks. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have other matters to attend to." "You built a fence through my garden. You built a garden on HOA property." "The fence simply corrects that error." "Good day, Mr. Radford." She turned and walked back to her office, closing the door firmly. I stood there for a moment, feeling the receptionist's sympathetic gaze. "She's always like this," the young woman whispered. "I'm sorry." I left the office and sat in my car, trying to think clearly. This wasn't going to be resolved through normal channels. Patricia Cunningham had already made up her mind, and she clearly had no intention of listening to reason or looking at actual legal documents. I drove to the county recorder's office in downtown Riverside. It took an hour of waiting and another hour of paperwork, but I walked out with certified copies of my property survey, my deed, and the original subdivision plat map from 1976 that showed the exact boundaries of every lot in Riverside Meadows. The triangle was mine. No question, no debate, no ambiguity. I also stopped by a hardware store and bought some surveyor stakes and bright orange marking paint. If they wanted to play games with property lines, I could make things very clear. Back at home, I used the survey coordinates to mark out my actual property line. I hammered stakes into the ground and sprayed bright orange paint along the boundary. The fence was a full 15 feet past the line at its deepest point. Then I did something that probably wasn't the smartest move, but I was angry. I went to my garage and got my reciprocating saw. The fence was on my property. I had the documents to prove it, and I was not about to let the HOA steal my land. I measured out exactly where my property line fell on the fence. Then I cut it. I cut vertically through the boards, through the rails, right down to where the posts were set in concrete. It took 3 hours and 2 saw blades, but when I was done, there was a clear gap in the fence exactly where my property line ran. The section of fence on my land, I dismantled board by board. I unscrewed the rails, pulled down the pickets, and used a pickaxe to break up the concrete around the posts until I could lever them out of the ground. It was hard, sweaty work, but by late afternoon the fence ended precisely at my property boundary. My garden was a mess. The tomato plants were unsalvageable, and the cucumber bed would need to be completely rebuilt, but the section of land was clear again. I was loading the fence sections into a rented dumpster when my neighbor, Tom, came over. Tom was a good guy, a retired teacher who mostly kept to himself. "Victor, what are you doing? The HOA is going to lose their minds. The fence was on my property. I have the survey to prove it." Tom winced. "I believe you, man, but Patricia is going to make your life hell. She already called and threatened me with $500 a day fines. She's serious about that kind of thing. She fined the Hendersons $10,000 last year because they repainted their house the wrong shade of beige. The Hendersons paid that. They're still fighting it in court. It's a mess." I wiped the sweat from my forehead. "I'm not going to let her steal my land, Tom." He nodded slowly. "I get it. Just be careful. Patricia has been HOA president for 8 years. She's got the whole board in her pocket and she doesn't lose gracefully." The next morning, I found a citation attached to my front door. It was printed on official-looking HOA letterhead and informed me that I was being fined $500 per day for destruction of HOA property, violation of community standards, and unauthorized modification of common area boundaries. The daily fine had started yesterday, meaning I already owed $1,000. I called a lawyer. Martin Webb had been recommended by a friend who had used him for a property dispute with a contractor. His office was in a strip mall in Morno Valley, and he looked like every lawyer on TV, complete with the slightly rumpled suit and the office walls covered in framed diplomas and bar certifications. "So the HOA built a fence on your property, you removed it, and now they're fining you," Martin summarized after I explained the situation. "That's the short version." He looked through my documents. "Your survey is solid. The property is clearly yours. The HOA has no legitimate claim to it. So what do I do? First, you send them a cease and desist letter. I'll draft it. It will inform them that they've trespassed on your property, demand they acknowledge your property rights, and warn them that you'll pursue legal action if they continue with the fines. And if that doesn't work, then we file suit. Property disputes are actually pretty straightforward when you have documentation this clear. The problem is that it takes time and money. How much money, if they fight it, could be $20,000 to $30,000 in legal fees, maybe more if they really dig in. I felt sick. "I don't have that kind of money." Martin leaned back in his chair. "Here's the thing about HOAs. They're spending the community's money, not their own. They can afford to drag things out because it's not coming from their personal bank accounts. But there's another option." "What's that?" "You could file a complaint with the county. If your survey is correct, and I believe it is, then the HOA has constructed an unpermitted structure on private property. The county might get involved, especially if there are other violations. Would that cost me anything? Just your time. But it might get the county code enforcement on your side, which could pressure the HOA to back down." I left his office with a plan. Martin would send the cease and desist letter, which would cost me $500. Meanwhile, I would file a complaint with Riverside County Code Enforcement about the fence. But I also had another idea. That afternoon, I went to a local nursery and bought 6 blackberry plants. Not just any blackberries either. I bought Himalayan blackberries, the most aggressive, thorny, impossible to control variety I could find. The nursery owner actually tried to talk me out of it. "These things are invasive," he warned. "They'll take over everything." "Perfect," I said. I planted the blackberries along the entire length of where the fence had been on my property. I spaced them about 3 feet apart and watered them heavily. Himalayan blackberries are nearly indestructible once established. They grow fast, they spread by underground runners, and they're covered in thorns that can shred clothes and skin with equal efficiency. If the HOA wanted to claim that land, they were going to have to deal with the blackberries first. I also planted them specifically on my side of the property line, but close enough that the canes would naturally grow toward the HOA's precious common area. In a few months, they would be a thorny nightmare. In a year, they would be impenetrable. The response to Martin's cease and desist letter came 5 days later. It was not from Patricia Cunningham, but from an attorney named Donald Reynolds, representing the Riverside Meadows HOA. The letter was dismissive and aggressive. It claimed that the HOA's survey was correct, that my property documents were outdated, and that I had committed vandalism by removing the fence. They were not only continuing the $500 per day fine, but they were now adding an additional $2,000 for legal fees, and demanding I pay for the reinstallation of the fence section I had removed. Total amount claimed, $12,500, with the daily fine continuing to accumulate. Martin called me after receiving a copy of the letter. "They're not backing down. In fact, they're escalating. This is unusual even for an HOA dispute." What does that mean? It means they're either completely convinced they're right, or there's something else going on. Has anything seemed odd about the HOA's behavior beyond this fence issue? I thought about it. They've always been strict, but this level of aggression is new. Patricia Cunningham has been president for years, but she's never been this openly hostile. I'm going to do some research on the HOA's finances. Sometimes these situations arise when there's money involved. Maybe they're planning development on that common area or something similar. The county code enforcement inspector came out 3 days later. Her name was Sandra Mills, and she was thorough. She reviewed my property documents, walked the property line with a measuring tape and GPS unit, and took extensive photographs. "Mr. Radford, your property survey is accurate. The fence was definitely on your land. So the HOA was in the wrong, absolutely. They should have pulled a permit for the fence anyway, but building it on private property without the owner's consent is trespassing and potentially criminal property damage. What happens now?" I'm going to issue a violation notice to the HOA. They'll need to acknowledge the correct property line and cease any encroachment on your land. If they don't comply, the county can take further action. "Can they still fine me?" Sandra frowned. "The HOA can fine you for legitimate covenant violations, but they can't fine you for removing a structure that was illegally placed on your property. If they continue, you should definitely pursue legal action. You might also want to file a police report for the property damage to your garden." That was a good idea. I went to the Riverside Police Department and filed a report. The officer who took my statement was sympathetic, but not particularly optimistic. Property disputes with HOAs are usually civil matters. Unless there's clear evidence of intentional criminal activity, we don't usually get involved. They destroyed my garden and built a fence on my land. I understand, and I'm documenting everything. but you'll probably need to handle this through the courts. Keep all your documentation, and if they do anything else, call us immediately." The blackberries were already growing. It had only been 2 weeks, but the plants had established themselves and were sending out new canes. I watered them faithfully and even added some fertilizer to encourage growth. My garden was slowly recovering. I had replanted the tomatoes and rebuilt the cucumber bed. The pepper plants that had been on the wrong side of the fence before were now accessible again, and they were loaded with jalapenos and bell peppers. Then, on a Tuesday morning exactly 1 month after the fence incident, I woke up to find construction equipment in the HOA common area behind my property. I went out to investigate. There was a crew of workers, several trucks, and what looked like preparation for a major landscaping project. But they were also setting up fence posts again, in exactly the same spots where I had removed them. I walked over to the crew foreman. "What are you doing?" He looked at a clipboard. "Installing fence for the HOA. We've got a work order to complete the fence line along this section." "This is private property. You can't build here," he shrugged. "I just go where the work order says. You need to talk to whoever hired us." I pulled out my phone and called Martin immediately. While I was on the phone with him, a county code enforcement vehicle pulled up. Sandra Mills got out, looking annoyed. "Mr. Radford, I got an alert that there was construction activity at this address. What's going on?" I pointed to the crew. "They're trying to rebuild the fence on my property." Sandra walked over to the foreman. "Do you have a permit for this work?" The HOA said they'd handle permits. "There's no permit on file for this address. You need to stop work immediately." The foreman looked annoyed but started calling his workers to pack up. Sandra walked over to me. "This is getting out of hand. The HOA received my violation notice. They know this is your property. This is starting to look like intentional harassment." "What can I do?" "Document everything. File another police report. And seriously consider getting a restraining order against the HOA if this continues." That afternoon, I received a hand-delivered letter from Patricia Cunningham. Not from her lawyer this time, but from her personally. The tone was nasty. "Mr. Radford, your continued interference with HOA business has become unacceptable. The fence will be completed as planned. Your fraudulent property claims will not be honored. If you continue to vandalize HOA property, we will pursue criminal charges against you. You now owe $18,500 in fines and fees. Payment is due immediately." I called Martin again. "They're threatening criminal charges against me now." "For what? Removing a fence from your own property? That's absurd." "What do I do?" "We file suit. Today. I'll start the paperwork. We're going after them for trespassing, property damage, harassment, and abuse of HOA authority. We're also going to request an injunction preventing them from any further construction on your property." "How much is this going to cost me?" "I'll work on a contingency basis. We're going to ask for damages and attorney fees in the suit. If we win, and I believe we will, the HOA pays for everything. And if we lose, we won't. Your documentation is too solid, but Victor, you need to be prepared for this to get worse before it gets better." HOA disputes can get ugly, and Patricia Cunningham sounds like someone who doesn't know when to quit. The lawsuit was filed 3 days later. Martin filed it in Riverside County Superior Court, naming the Riverside Meadows HOA, Patricia Cunningham personally, and the HOA board members as defendants. We asked for $25,000 in damages for the destroyed garden, harassment, and legal fees, plus an injunction preventing any further encroachment on my property. The blackberries were thriving. The canes were already 4 feet long and starting to spread. I had trained some of them along the property line, and they were forming a thorny barrier that would be extremely unpleasant to cross. The HOA's response was swift. Within a week of being served with the lawsuit, they filed a counter-suit against me for the $18,000 in fines, plus an additional $10,000 in emotional distress, allegedly suffered by Patricia Cunningham, due to my aggressive and threatening behavior. I had never threatened anyone. I had never even raised my voice, except maybe in frustration during phone calls. Martin was not surprised. It's a classic intimidation tactic. They're trying to scare you into dropping the suit by making the financial stakes higher. Don't worry. We have all the evidence on our side. The first hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. In the meantime, life in Riverside Meadows became increasingly uncomfortable. My mail started being marked as undeliverable and returned to sender, even though my mailbox was clearly labeled. My trash cans were repeatedly cited for being placed at the curb more than 12 hours before pickup, even though I was putting them out at the same time I had for 3 years. I received a citation for my grass being too long, even though I had just mowed it the day before. The harassment was constant and petty. Tom, my neighbor, told me that Patricia had been going door to door in the neighborhood, warning people about the problem resident, who was suing the HOA and causing trouble for everyone. "She's telling people that you're trying to steal community property," Tom said. "Most people don't know the real story. Should I tell them? I don't know if it would help. Patricia has been president for so long, a lot of people just believe whatever she says. But not everyone believed her." A few neighbors reached out to me quietly, expressing support. One of them, a woman named Margaret Holloway, told me she had her own horror story about Patricia. She fined me $5,000 because I planted roses in my front yard. Roses. She said they weren't on the approved plant list. I had to dig them all up and replace them with whatever boring shrubs she approved. I'm glad someone is finally standing up to her. The blackberries grew. By midsummer, they were enormous. The canes were 8 feet long in places, covered in thorns and white flowers that would eventually become fruit. They formed a natural fence along the property line, far more effective than any wooden structure. The HOA sent me a citation for unapproved landscaping and demanded I remove the blackberries. I ignored it. They sent another citation with another $500 fine. I ignored that too. By the time the first hearing arrived, the HOA claimed I owed them over $30,000 in various fines. The courthouse in downtown Riverside was busy on the morning of our hearing. Martin met me outside, carrying a briefcase full of documents. "Remember, stay calm, be respectful to the judge, and let me do most of the talking." Got it. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Judge Ellen Richardson. She had a reputation, Martin had told me, for being no-nonsense and impatient with frivolous cases. Patricia Cunningham sat on the other side of the courtroom with her attorney, Donald Reynolds. She looked confident, almost smug. Reynolds was a slick-looking man in an expensive suit. Judge Richardson called the case. Radford versus Riverside Meadows Homeowners Association. I've reviewed the initial filings. Mr. Reynolds, your client built a fence on Mr. Radford's property, correct? Your Honor, the HOA disputes that characterization. The fence was built on HOA common area property. You have a survey showing that. We have HOA records indicating the boundaries of common areas. That's not what I asked. Do you have a legal survey? Reynolds hesitated. The HOA's records have been maintained since the community was established in 1976. So no survey. Mr. Webb, your client has a survey. Martin stood. Yes, Your Honor. We have the original property survey from when Mr. Radford purchased the home, as well as certified copies of the subdivision plat and county records. All documents clearly show the disputed area is private property. Let me see them. Martin approached the bench and handed up copies of all our documents. Judge Richardson reviewed them carefully, her expression growing increasingly annoyed. Mr. Reynolds, this survey is very clear. The property in question belongs to Mr. Radford. What evidence does your client have to contradict this? Your Honor, the HOA has maintained the disputed area as common space for decades. We believe there's been an adverse possession claim. Adverse possession requires 20 years of open, continuous hostile use in California. Has the HOA maintained that area exclusively for 20 years? Reynolds faltered. The exact timeline is unclear, but the HOA has mowed and maintained the green space. Mowing grass doesn't establish adverse possession, Counselor. Especially when the actual property owner has been paying taxes on it and using it themselves. What else do you have? The HOA's authority to manage common areas is established in the CC and Articles, which don't allow the HOA to claim private property as common area. Is there anything else? Reynolds looked frustrated. No, Your Honor. Judge Richardson set down the papers. Here's what's going to happen. The HOA is going to immediately cease all fines against Mr. Radford related to the fence or the disputed property. The HOA is enjoined from any construction or encroachment on Mr. Radford's property, as clearly defined by the legal survey. Mr. Radford is entitled to damages for the destroyed garden. We'll have an evidentiary hearing on the amount. And frankly, Mr. Reynolds, you should advise your client that continuing this frivolous dispute could result in sanctions. This is cut and dry. The property belongs to Mr. Radford. Patricia Cunningham stood up suddenly. Your Honor, that man is destroying community property with those weeds he planted. Judge Richardson looked at her coolly. Mrs. Cunningham, I assume, you're not speaking through your attorney. Those blackberries are a nuisance. Are they on his property? They're growing onto common area. Then the HOA can trim them at the property line. That's what neighbors do. But you cannot dictate what Mr. Radford plants on his own land, and you certainly can't fine him for it. Sit down, please. Patricia sat, her face red with anger. The hearing concluded with the injunction in place and a date set for the damages hearing. Martin was pleased. That went about as well as it could have. Judge Richardson saw right through their nonsense. What about the $30,000 they claim I owe? It's going to be dismissed. Those fines were all based on the false claim that you were violating HOA rules. Since the property is yours and their fence was illegal, there's no basis for any of the fines. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. So it's over. Not quite. We still have the damages hearing and we need to see if they appeal. But you won. The important part is done. I celebrated that night with a beer on my back patio, looking at my garden. The tomatoes were producing heavily. The blackberries were covered in ripe fruit, dark purple and sweet. I picked a handful and ate them, savoring the taste of victory. But Patricia Cunningham was not done. 2 weeks after the hearing, I received a notice that the HOA was calling a special meeting to discuss the Radford situation and proposing several new rules. All homeowners were invited to attend. I decided to go. The HOA meeting was held in the community building on a Thursday evening. About 40 homeowners showed up, which was apparently a large turnout. Most HOA meetings, I was told, drew maybe 10 people. Patricia stood at the front of the room with the other board members. She called the meeting to order and immediately launched into her agenda. As many of you know, we're dealing with a resident who has refused to cooperate with community standards. Despite the HOA's best efforts to maintain our property values and neighborhood aesthetics, this individual has filed a frivolous lawsuit, vandalized HOA property, and planted invasive weeds that are threatening our common areas. Several people turned to look at me. I kept my expression neutral. Tonight, we're proposing several new rules to protect our community. First, we're proposing a ban on all thorned plants within 50 feet of common areas. Second, we're proposing that the HOA have final approval over all landscaping visible from common areas. Third, we're proposing increased fines for residents who interfere with HOA maintenance and improvements. Margaret Holloway, the woman who had told me about her rose incident, raised her hand. Patricia, I read about the court case in the meeting minutes. The judge ruled against the HOA. Why are we still talking about this? The judge made a preliminary ruling based on incomplete information. We're appealing. The meeting minutes said the judge called the HOA's case frivolous. Patricia's expression tightened. That's taken out of context. Another homeowner, a man I didn't know, spoke up. I'm confused. If the property belongs to Mr. Radford, how can the HOA regulate what he plants on it? The CC and Articus give the HOA authority over all aspects of neighborhood aesthetics. But not on private property that's not visible from the street, the man countered. I actually read the CC and Articus when I bought my house. Tom, my neighbor, stood up. Patricia, I think we need to be honest here. The HOA made a mistake. The fence was built on Victor's property. The judge confirmed it. Why are we wasting more community money fighting this? We're protecting property values. By harassing a homeowner who was in the right, that doesn't protect property values. That exposes the HOA to liability. More homeowners started speaking up. It became clear that Patricia had overplayed her hand. People were not blindly supporting her the way she expected. Several homeowners pointed out that the constant legal battles were draining the HOA's reserve fund. Others expressed concern about the precedent of the HOA claiming private property. One homeowner, an older man named Frank, made the most important point. Patricia, how much has the HOA spent on legal fees for this fence issue? Patricia hesitated. That's confidential board business. No, it's not. Homeowners have a right to know how their dues are being spent. How much? The exact amount is still being calculated. Give us an estimate. Patricia looked at Donald Reynolds, who had been sitting quietly in the corner. He shrugged. She finally answered. Approximately $45,000 so far. The room erupted. $45,000 on a fence that was proven to be illegally placed. Several homeowners were shouting questions. How could the board approve that spending? Why hadn't they checked the property lines before building? Who was going to pay for this? Margaret stood up. I'm calling for a vote of no confidence in the board. This is mismanagement of community funds. That's not on the agenda, Patricia said. I'm making a motion to add it to the agenda. You can't do that. Another homeowner, who apparently knew the rules better than Patricia, spoke up. Actually, any homeowner can make a motion at an HOA meeting. That's in the bylaws. This is out of order, Patricia insisted, but it was too late. The room was in chaos. Homeowners were angry about the money, angry about the handling of the fence issue, and angry about Patricia's high-handed leadership style. Several people were calling for a special election to replace the board. The meeting dissolved without any of Patricia's proposed rules being voted on. As people filed out, several homeowners came up to me to apologize for the HOA's behavior and express support. Frank, the older man who had asked about the legal fees, shook my hand. I've been in this neighborhood for 20 years. Patricia has been getting more and more out of control. She needed to be checked. Good for you for standing up to her. 3 days later, I received a certified letter informing me that a special election had been called to recall the HOA board. Apparently, Margaret and several other homeowners had collected enough signatures to force the vote. The election was held 6 weeks later. The turnout was unprecedented. Nearly every homeowner in Riverside Meadows voted. Patricia Cunningham and 3 other board members were removed from their positions. New board members were elected, including Frank and Margaret. One of the new board's first actions was to formally acknowledge my property rights and drop all fines against me. They also issued an apology for the fence incident. But the story wasn't quite over. Martin called me 2 weeks after the election. "Victor, we need to talk about something that came up during the discovery process for the damages hearing." "What's that?" "I've been reviewing the HOA's financial records that were subpoenaed. There's something odd about the spending on the fence project." "Like what?" "The fence cost about $12,000 to build, but the HOA paid a company called Meadows Construction $35,000. Maybe there were other expenses." "That's what I thought, but when I looked into Meadows Construction, I found something interesting. The company is owned by Patricia Cunningham's brother-in-law." I sat up straight. She was stealing from the HOA. It looks like it. The inflated construction costs, the aggressive defense of the fence placement, the refusal to back down even when it was clear she was wrong. I think she was trying to hide the fraud by doubling down. "What do we do?" "I'm required to report this to the authorities. This could be criminal fraud and embezzlement." Martin contacted the Riverside County District Attorney's office. An investigation was opened into the HOA's finances under Patricia Cunningham's leadership. It turned out the fence was just the beginning. Over 8 years, as HOA president, Patricia had funneled over $200,000 in inflated contracts to companies owned by her family members. The fence was the first time anyone had questioned the spending closely enough to notice. Patricia Cunningham was arrested 6 months later and charged with embezzlement, fraud, and misappropriation of funds. Her trial was set for the following year. The damages hearing for my case was scheduled for late fall. The new HOA board, under Margaret's leadership, approached Martin about settling. "We want to make this right," Margaret told me at a community barbecue. "The old board screwed up and you suffered for it. We're prepared to pay for all your damages, your legal fees, and additional compensation for the harassment you endured." The settlement was finalized a month later. The HOA paid me $28,000, which covered my legal fees, the destroyed garden, and compensation for the months of stress and harassment. They also paid for a professional landscaper to restore my garden beds to perfect condition. The blackberries remained. In fact, they had become something of a neighborhood feature. The thorny canes grew thick and produced abundant fruit. I started making blackberry jam and sharing it with neighbors. People would come by during berry season with containers, and I would let them pick as much as they wanted. Tom helped me build a proper trellis system to keep the blackberries manageable. We trained the canes along the property line, creating a living fence that was far more beautiful than the wooden one Patricia had tried to force through my garden. Patricia Cunningham's trial took place the following spring. I attended the sentencing hearing. She was found guilty on multiple counts of embezzlement and fraud. The judge sentenced her to 4 years in prison and ordered her to pay full restitution to the HOA. As she was led out of the courtroom, she looked older and smaller than the aggressive woman who had called me that morning to inform me about the fence. Her lawyer had argued for probation, citing her age and her previously clean record, but the judge had been unmoved. "You held a position of trust in your community," Judge Richardson had said. "You betrayed that trust for personal gain over many years. The sentence reflects the serious nature of your crimes. Life in Riverside Meadows improved dramatically after the board change. The new board focused on actual community improvement rather than petty rule enforcement. They repainted the community building, updated the playground, and started a neighborhood garden program on some of the HOA common space. My own garden flourished. The tomatoes came back better than ever. I added raised beds for lettuce and herbs. The pepper plants produced so heavily that I started giving bags of jalapenos to anyone who wanted them, and the blackberries became legendary. They grew thick and wild along the property line, covered in fruit every summer. I made gallons of jam, froze berries for winter smoothies, and still had enough to share with the entire neighborhood. One afternoon, about 2 years after the fence incident, I was in my garden picking blackberries when Margaret came by. "Victor, I wanted to thank you again for everything you did. If you hadn't stood up to Patricia, we might never have discovered the embezzlement. She could have kept stealing for years." "I was just protecting my tomatoes," I said with a smile. "Well, your tomatoes saved the neighborhood, and these blackberries are amazing." I handed her a container. "Take as many as you want. There's plenty." She started picking berries, carefully avoiding the thorns. "You know, when Patricia built that fence, she thought she was being clever. She probably figured you would just accept it and move on. Most people would have. I'm stubborn." "No, you're principled. There's a difference. You stood up for what was right, even when it was expensive and stressful and everyone thought you were crazy." "Not everyone thought I was crazy. Enough people did, but you were right and you proved it. The neighborhood is better because you didn't back down." Frank organized a neighborhood party that summer. It was held in the common area behind the homes, the same area Patricia had tried to claim extended over my property. Someone brought a guitar. Someone else brought a grill. People brought food and drinks, and we spent the evening celebrating the community we had rebuilt. I brought blackberry jam. Jars and jars of it with handwritten labels. People loved it. Several neighbors asked if I would teach them how to make it. Standing there, surrounded by neighbors who had become friends, looking at my thriving garden with its abundance of vegetables and those triumphant blackberry canes, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The fence that Patricia built had been meant to take something from me. Instead, it had given me something better. It had given me a community. Tom came over with 2 beers and handed me one. "Remember when you were cutting up that fence with your saw? I thought you were insane. I remember you telling me Patricia would make my life hell. She tried. But you made blackberries instead." He clinked his beer against mine. "To blackberries. To blackberries," I agreed. The sun was setting behind the houses, casting long shadows across the common area. The blackberry canes rustled in the evening breeze, heavy with fruit. My tomato plants were loaded with red fruit. The pepper plants had dozens of peppers growing. Everything I had fought for was thriving. In the end, Patricia Cunningham had tried to take my land, and she had ended up losing everything. Her position, her reputation, her freedom. All because she couldn't admit she was wrong about a 15-foot triangle of earth. I had learned something important through the whole ordeal. Sometimes the right thing to do is also the hard thing. Standing up to the HOA had cost me time, money, and stress. There were moments when I wondered if it was worth it, if I should just let it go and move on, but I had been right. The land was mine. The survey proved it. And by standing firm, by refusing to be bullied or intimidated, I had not only protected my own rights, but exposed corruption that had been harming the entire community for years. The blackberries were a symbol of that resistance. Patricia had ordered me to remove them, had fined me for them, had tried to use HOA authority to force me to dig them up. But they grew anyway, spreading their thorny canes and sweet fruit, beautiful and wild and completely outside her control. Margaret started a toast. To Victor, who taught us all that sometimes you have to grow thorns to protect what matters. Everyone raised their glasses. I felt embarrassed by the attention but also grateful. These people had supported me when it mattered. They had questioned Patricia's authority when I needed allies. They had voted for change when the system was broken. And to tomatoes, Frank added, because apparently tomatoes are worth going to war over. They really are, I said, and everyone laughed. The party continued into the night. Children ran around playing tag. Adults sat in lawn chairs talking and laughing. The community building that Patricia had ruled from like a fortress was now just another building, occupied by a board that actually served the homeowners. As I walked home later that evening, my hands stained purple from picking blackberries, I looked at my house with fresh appreciation. It was mine. The land was mine. The garden was mine. No HOA president, no matter how aggressive or corrupt, could take that away. The fence section that Patricia had built through my garden was long gone, broken up and hauled away to the dump 2 years ago. In its place was something much better. A living barrier of thorny canes that produced sweet fruit, a reminder that sometimes the best revenge is simply to grow something beautiful where someone tried to build a wall. I went inside, washed the berry stains from my hands and looked at the calendar. Tomorrow, I would start harvesting tomatoes for salsa. Next week, I would pick the last of the summer peppers. And in a month, when the blackberries ripened again, I would make another batch of jam to share with the neighborhood. Life was good in Riverside, California. My garden was thriving, my neighbors were friends, and the woman who tried to steal my land was in prison where she belonged. Justice had been served, literally and figuratively. And through it all, the blackberries kept growing, spreading their thorny canes exactly where I wanted them, wild and free and absolutely unstoppable, just like me.